Detroit, Michigan, early winter. Snow clung to the roofs like a stubborn memory, melting in uneven patches on the cracked streets. The sky was the color of lead, heavy and oppressive, pressing down on every brick and every breath. Inside an aging wooden house on Evergreen Street, 65-year-old James Wilson sat at his kitchen table, his hands trembling not only from age but from the draft that slipped through the window frame. That house had been his fortress for more than 3 decades. It was where he and his late wife, Mary, had built a life together, where birthdays had been celebrated with store-bought cakes, where Christmas mornings had been filled with wrapping paper scattered like confetti, where the laughter of his only son, Michael, had once filled every room. But on this morning the house was suffocatingly silent, the kind of silence that screamed louder than any fight. At the kitchen doorway stood Michael. 30-something now, with sharp lines etched across his face that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with choices. He wasn't smiling. His eyes, once the bright brown of a boy who dreamed big, were now cold, guarded, and calculating. In his hand was a thick envelope and a stack of papers. James looked up, forcing the corners of his mouth into a weak smile. For a second, a flicker of hope crossed his eyes, hope that maybe his son had come to talk, to share coffee, to be family again. But that fragile hope shattered with the first words out of Michael's mouth. "Dad," Michael said flatly, his voice devoid of warmth, "I've taken your pension. You'll have $17 left. From now on, think of yourself as renting this house." The words hung in the air like shards of glass, each syllable slicing deeper than the last. James froze. He stared at his son, uncomprehending. His hand tightened around the chipped coffee mug, so hard that steaming liquid spilled onto his palm, scalding the skin. But he didn't flinch. He didn't feel the burn. All he felt was the sudden, paralyzing weight in his chest, as though his heart had stopped beating. What did you just say, Michael?" His voice cracked, brittle as dry wood. Michael didn't blink. He slid the envelope across the table. It landed with a thud that seemed far too loud for such a small thing. Inside, James found a wrinkled slip of paper and 17 crumpled dollars. That was all. "This is what you get to keep," Michael said. "The rest has already been transferred. You know we need the money, Sarah, the kids, the bills, the debts. Everyone has to sacrifice. Sacrifice." He said it so casually, like it was noble, as if robbing his father blind could ever be draped in righteousness. James's chest ached. Memories collided in his mind. The day he sold his Ford F-150 truck to pay Michael's college tuition, the overtime shifts at the factory to cover medical bills for his wife, while still slipping extra cash into Michael's account, the moment he signed the deed of this very house over to Michael to help him with taxes. All of it, every sacrifice, every sleepless night, now mocked him. His breath came in ragged bursts. "Michael, this isn't just money. This is my life, my years, my blood and bones. You can't." But Michael cut him off sharply. "You've done your part, Dad. It's my turn now. You just need to stay quiet. Don't make this harder than it has to be." There was no respect in his voice, no gratitude, just a chilling, transactional coldness. James wanted to shout. He wanted to slam his fist on the table and demand to know, "Where is my son? Where is the boy I raised, the boy I carried on my shoulders, the boy I would have died for?" But the words strangled themselves in his throat. Instead, humiliation seeped through him, a bitter poison that spread to every vein. His eyes fell to the table, to the pitiful $17, to the proof that his worth as a father, as a man, had been reduced to pocket change. Outside, the Detroit wind howled against the window panes, a mournful symphony. Inside, James realized something horrifying. He was no longer the master of his own home. He had been demoted to a tenant in the very life he built. In that exact moment, his heart fractured, but from the shards of betrayal. Something else stirred deep within him, something darker, something fierce. A flame of rage, a whisper of vengeance, a desperate hunger for justice. $17 had stolen his dignity, but it had also awakened a part of him long buried. This wasn't the end, it was only the beginning. James tried to steady his breath, but the air in his lungs felt heavy, poisoned by betrayal. He stared at Michael, hoping to find even the faintest flicker of remorse. But his son's face was a mask of stone, jaw clenched, eyes sharp with the kind of determination that comes not from courage but from greed. "Michael," James whispered, his voice barely audible. "Son, listen to yourself. Do you even hear the words you're saying? This house, this pension, it's all I have left. Without it, I'm nothing. You can't I can, Michael interrupted coldly. And I have, Dad, you don't get it. Times are different now. You don't understand what it takes to survive out there. Sarah's drowning in debt. The kids need private school, not those broken public systems. You want me to raise them in the same kind of struggle you dragged us through. Struggle. The word pierced James like a knife, dragged us through. He blinked, stunned. He wanted to scream, I worked myself to the bone for you. I broke my back in the factory. I skipped meals so you could eat better. I sold the car I loved so you could go to college. But the words tangled in his throat. Instead, his eyes burned, brimming with tears he refused to shed. Michael, he tried again, softer this time, almost pleading. I gave you everything, your education, your home. Your start in life, it all came from me and your mother. Don't you remember? Don't you care? For the briefest second, Michael's jaw twitched. Something human flickered in his eyes, regret, maybe even guilt, but it was gone as quickly as it came. This isn't about the past, Michael said, sliding the papers closer. It's about now, about the future. My family's future. You'll be fine, Dad. You've still got a roof over your head. $17 for groceries if you're careful. That's enough. That word echoed like thunder in James's skull. $17, enough, for the man who had poured decades of sweat, blood, and love into raising him, into keeping a roof over his head. Enough. James's hands shook violently now, not from the cold, but from rage so deep it felt volcanic. His chest tightened, and for a terrifying moment he thought he might collapse. But no, this pain wasn't going to take him. Not yet. You've killed something in me today. Michael, James finally said, his voice hollow. And one day you'll realize what you've done. You've stolen more than money. You've stolen the last piece of respect between a father and a son. Michael shifted uncomfortably but didn't back down. You'll thank me one day, maybe not now, but eventually. You'll see I had no choice. And with that he turned. He left the papers, left the $17 on the table, left his father to drown in silence. The sound of the front door slamming echoed like a gunshot through the empty house. The silence that followed was suffocating. James sat motionless at the kitchen table, staring at the crumpled bills as if they might rearrange themselves into the life he had just lost. The coffee had gone cold, forgotten. His hands lay limp in his lap, palms open, fingers twitching. For a long time he couldn't move, couldn't even think. Only the memories came sharp, unrelenting, cruel. He remembered Michael at 7 years old, running barefoot through the backyard, giggling as Mary chased him with a garden hose. He remembered Michael at 16, slamming doors and shouting, I hate you, only to return an hour later with tearful apologies. He remembered the day he dropped Michael off at college, hugging him so tight he thought he'd never let go. And now here he was, 65 years old, alone, reduced to $17. His chest rose and fell in ragged sobs he tried to swallow, but the house heard them. The house absorbed them. The walls that had once vibrated with laughter now trembled with grief. Slowly, painfully, James stood. His legs felt weak, as if betrayal had stolen not only his savings, but also the strength from his body. He walked to the window and pulled back the curtain. Outside, Detroit streets stretched before him, cold, broken, forgotten. He saw the boarded-up houses, the rusting cars, the kids with nowhere safe to play. He had survived this city's storms, its layoffs, its decay. He had endured it all, believing it was worth it to give his son a better life. Now he realized the cruelest truth. Sometimes sacrifice doesn't create gratitude. Sometimes it creates entitlement. James pressed his forehead to the cold glass. The snow outside swirled like ashes, and in that swirl he felt something ignite inside him. Not hope, not yet, something darker, something he hadn't felt since his youth. The vow, this was not how his story would end. The next morning arrived with no mercy. James woke to the creak of the furnace coughing through its final breaths. The old heating system had been limping for years, patched together with duct tape, scrap metal, and prayers. Detroit winters were unkind, and the chill slithered under his blanket, biting at his bones. For a moment, lying in bed, he forgot. He thought Mary might still be in the kitchen, humming softly while she scrambled eggs. He thought Michael might stumble in from his old bedroom, rubbing his eyes, asking for cereal. But then the silence reminded him. Silence always told the truth. The kitchen was as he'd left it, coffee rings staining the table, 17 crumpled dollars still sitting there like a mockery. James picked them up, turning them over between his fingers as if they might multiply with enough pressure. They didn't. He tucked them into his wallet and sighed. Today he needed groceries. Outside, the streets of Detroit stretched in bleak gray. The once bustling factories were hollow shells, their windows shattered, walls tattooed with graffiti. The same corner store he'd been walking to for 30 years stood stubbornly on the block, but its sign had faded, its shelves half empty. As James trudged through the slush, his breath puffing clouds into the frozen air, he passed his neighbor, Mrs. Lopez, a widow herself. Her husband had died 10 years back from asbestos in the auto plant. She leaned on her cane, struggling to shovel the snow from her walkway. "Morning, James," she called, her voice raspy. "Morning, Maria," James answered, pausing to help. He took the shovel from her hands despite her protest. "Let me, you'll break your back out here." She gave him a small smile, her eyes weary. "We're all breaking our backs, James. Some of us just don't know it yet." The words stung. They reminded him of Michael, of how his son had dismissed his years of sacrifice as if they were nothing but chains dragging him down. James swallowed hard, finishing the walkway in silence. Before he left, Mrs. Lopez touched his arm. "You okay, James? You look tired." He forced a nod. "Just didn't sleep well." He didn't tell her the truth. How could he? How could he explain that his own flesh and blood had stripped him bare, leaving him with nothing but $17 and the kind of loneliness that gnaws through a man's soul? The grocery store was nearly empty, the aisles echoing with fluorescent hum. James moved slowly, scanning the shelves with precision, calculating with the care of a man whose survival depended on it. Beans, rice, a loaf of bread, milk if it wasn't overpriced. He held the items in his basket like fragile treasures, already aware he'd have to stretch them for weeks. Every step felt like humiliation, a reminder of how far he'd fallen. Once he had bought groceries for a family of 3, piling the cart high with Michael's favorite snacks. Now, a basket half full was almost too heavy. At the register, the cashier, a young man with tired eyes and tattoos curling up his arms, rang him up without a word. When James handed over one of his crumpled bills, he saw the boy glance at it with pity. Or maybe it was judgment. James couldn't tell anymore. 17 left, James muttered under his breath as he walked out, clutching the small bag. Back home, the house felt colder than the streets. He placed the groceries in the cupboard, each item sliding onto the shelf with a hollow echo. He sat at the kitchen table again, staring at the wood grain until it blurred. This was his life now, a shrinking pension, a shrinking circle, a shrinking reason to keep going. He thought about calling Michael. Maybe, just maybe, his son had woken with guilt gnawing at him. Maybe he'd call, apologize, take it all back. James reached for the phone, dialed halfway, then stopped. No. Michael had made his choice. That night, James sat in the living room with the lights off. The television glowed faintly, showing the evening news. Another story about corporate bailouts, about executives pocketing millions while pension funds collapsed. Another story about seniors losing their homes. Another story about Detroit's forgotten residents. He watched silently, his fists clenching. It wasn't just Michael. The whole system was rigged. Men like him, men who had given their lives to industry, who had believed in the American dream, were discarded like broken tools. And yet those who betrayed them lived comfortably. Michael, the corporations, the politicians, all of them. James's reflection stared back at him from the dark screen once the news ended. His own eyes looked hollow, haunted, but behind them burned a quiet flame. "This isn't the end," he whispered to himself. "Not yet." The following days slipped by like frozen water. James moved through them mechanically, each morning beginning with the same routine: cold shower, brittle toast, and a careful inventory of the week's remaining food. Every sound in the house, creaking floors, the groan of the walls settling, felt magnified, as if the building itself were mourning with him. Detroit's streets outside the windows seemed almost surreal. Broken streetlights flickered intermittently, casting long, shaky shadows across empty lots where weeds pushed through cracked asphalt. Factories that had once hummed with life now stood as skeletal remains, their metal frames rusting in the winter wind. The city's decay mirrored James's own sense of desolation. There was a poetry to the ruins, but it was bitter, painful, unforgiving. He walked the streets daily, partly to keep himself sane, partly to gauge the pulse of the neighborhood. He noticed the same faces each day: the old man on the corner muttering to himself, the teenagers sliding through the snow in patched jackets, laughter hollow in their mouths, the mothers hauling infants through the slush, their eyes weary but fierce. Everyone was surviving, few were living. At the community center, James found a sliver of connection, not friendship, he was too careful, too proud for that, but recognition. Mr. Thompson, a retired teacher with a booming voice, waved as James entered. "Morning, James. Heard you lost your boy. Shame. This city chews us up, doesn't it?" James didn't answer, but he didn't need to. Mr. Thompson understood. The afternoons were worse. That was when memories came unbidden, like the chill of the wind cutting through the gaps in his coat. He remembered Michael as a boy, small and impish, chasing after him with a grin too wide for a child so young. He remembered teaching him how to ride a bike, holding the seat steady while Michael wobbled, terrified and exhilarated all at once. He remembered the late nights, sitting by the bedside after nightmares, Michael's small hand clutching his, whispering, "Daddy, I'm scared." And he had promised every night, every single time, that he would protect him. And then the betrayal. Michael, grown and hardened, turning his back, taking not just money, but dignity, honor, trust. All the promises James had made seemed to evaporate in a single moment of cold, calculated self-interest. Yet, James refused to succumb entirely to despair. There was a simmering force beneath his grief, one that refused to be extinguished by loss or injustice. It whispered to him as he walked the empty streets, a voice that was his own but sharper, colder. "You are not finished. You will not vanish quietly." He began making careful notes, small observations, patterns of the city, habits of the people around him, vulnerabilities. He watched the local council meetings, scribbled in his tattered notebook. Who spoke with sincerity? Who lied through their teeth? Where was the corruption hidden? Even Michael became a subject of analysis. He followed discreetly when the opportunity arose, noting meetings, interactions, and weaknesses. James's mind, once dulled by loneliness, now burned with a focused intensity. Some nights he allowed himself a quiet reflection of anger. Alone in the dark, he imagined confronting Michael, not with shouting, not with pleading, but with a presence so resolute it could not be ignored. He imagined exposing the lies, the manipulations, the years of neglect disguised as progress. He imagined justice, slow, deliberate, and inevitable, but there was a limit to his patience. Every day of watching, every hour of careful planning reminded him of the stakes. He was a man without wealth, without allies in the corridors of power. Yet he had something far more potent, a mind unclouded by fear and a soul hardened by betrayal. Amid this, a few small connections began to emerge. Maria Lopez became more than a neighbor. She became a confidant. On cold nights, he would check in, ensuring she had what she needed. In return, she shared snippets of neighborhood gossip, small truths hidden beneath everyday chatter. James absorbed these quietly, cataloging details that might later prove crucial. Other connections formed slowly. The boy at the grocery store, who reminded him painfully of Michael's childhood curiosity. An old friend from the auto plant, who shared stories of union struggles, layoffs, and forgotten promises. Each interaction, minor and fleeting, became a thread weaving James back into the fabric of a community he had long felt detached from. Winter deepened, bringing longer nights and harsher winds. James spent hours at his kitchen table, mapping the city's streets on old paper, marking names, addresses, vulnerabilities. He studied Michael's old contacts, people who had influenced him, allies and rivals alike. Every scrap of information felt like currency, a piece of leverage that could, someday, tip the balance in his favor. And in these solitary hours, James began to speak aloud, rehearsing conversations, arguments, confrontations. The words were sharp, deliberate, filled with controlled fury. He practiced patience as a weapon, letting his anger simmer beneath the surface while he sharpened his mind. It was during one of these sessions that he first realized the magnitude of his own determination. "I am still here, I still have time, I still have power." Detroit's decay was mirrored in the human condition. On the streets, James observed struggle and resilience intertwined. Families shared homes too small, neighbors helped each other shovel snow, children played in empty lots with nothing but imagination to shield them from the cold. And yet, corruption and greed coexisted alongside these glimpses of humanity, a constant reminder of what James would one day have to confront. He imagined a future where he could turn knowledge into action, where patience and planning would outweigh brute force or wealth. Each day of quiet observation strengthened his resolve. He began to see patterns where others saw chaos, strategies where others saw only despair. By the time spring threatened to break through the remaining ice, James's plan had begun to take shape, not yet fully formed, but the blueprint existed in his mind, calculated, deliberate, unyielding. Every memory, every observation, every betrayal contributed to a growing certainty that he would not fail, not this time. The morning sunlight had barely touched the streets of Detroit when James Wilson awoke to a silence that felt heavier than usual. For the past few weeks, he had been carefully measuring his steps, observing Michael's movements, cataloging small discrepancies and hints that the man who had once been his son was slowly revealing his true nature. But today, something felt different. The air carried a tension that made every creak of the old house floorboards echo like a warning bell. James swung his legs over the edge of the bed, letting the chill of the floor remind him of the long, hard winters he had endured working double shifts at the Ford plant. He had learned early on that comfort was a luxury, and now at 65, comfort was something he was determined to reclaim, not as a favor to anyone, but as a right earned through 40 years of sweat, persistence, and sacrifice. He moved quietly to the kitchen. Not because he feared confrontation, but because he had learned patience. He paused at the doorway, listening. The usual sounds of breakfast, the clatter of spoons against bowls, the hum of a coffee maker, the murmured voices of children getting ready for school were there, but they carried an undercurrent of something off, an edge of strain that made James's chest tighten. Michael was sitting at the table, his posture unusually rigid, his eyes darting toward James with something that wasn't quite fear but rather calculation. Sarah was at the counter, her hands shaking slightly as she poured cereal into bowls. Emma and Ethan were unusually quiet, their small faces drawn and wary. The scene should have been ordinary, even mundane. But James felt the storm before it hit, the unmistakable sense that the equilibrium he had struggled to maintain was about to shatter. "Morning, Dad," Michael said. His tone artificially casual, like a man trying to hide a blade behind a smile. "Sleep well." James didn't answer immediately. He took in the room, the way Michael's hand hovered over a folded stack of papers on the table, the unnatural gleam in his eyes, the almost imperceptible tension in Sarah's shoulders. Something had happened overnight, something deliberate. "Michael," James's voice was quiet but firm. He stepped fully into the kitchen. "Where's my check?" Michael's eyes flicked up, narrowing slightly. "Check," he repeated, with the mock innocence of a man who thought he could rewrite reality with a shrug. "What check?" James felt a cold, hollow knot form in his stomach. The pension check, the very symbol of the life he had worked for, was missing. He had placed it in the drawer the night before, under the sweater box where it would be safe. Now nothing, just the faint whisper of betrayal lingering in the air. "You took it," James said slowly, letting each word land with the weight of finality. "Where is it?" Michael leaned back, a calculated smirk forming on his lips. "I thought you might need it for rent," he said, spreading his arms as if offering James a cruel joke disguised as generosity. James felt the room tilt, the walls closing in. Rage, disbelief, and deep sorrow mingled into a storm that threatened to consume him. This was more than theft. This was an assault on his dignity, his decades of labor, his very right to autonomy. Michael had crossed a line, one that James had hoped would never be approached. But beneath the shock, a spark ignited, a flicker of resolve. The years of patient observation, of quietly gathering evidence, of mentally rehearsing every scenario had led to this moment. The betrayal was not just personal, it was systemic, and James realized he had the power to respond in kind. He clenched his fists, feeling the rough skin of his palms, remembering the work that had gone into building this life. 40 years of early mornings, endless overtime, missed birthdays, and sacrificial love for a son who now viewed him as a resource to exploit. The realization hit with a sudden, brutal clarity. Michael wasn't just careless, he was calculating, and this time James would be the one holding the calculation. Michael's smirk faltered slightly as he noticed the change in his father's demeanor. James's posture straightened, his eyes cold and unyielding. "This ends today," James said, voice low but unwavering. "I've tolerated enough. 40 years of my life, my work, my sacrifices, and you think you can just take it, treat me like I'm disposable." The words hung in the kitchen, charged with the electricity of confrontation. Sarah's hand stilled, the cereal frozen halfway to the bowl. Emma's eyes welled with tears, and Ethan's small body shrank slightly in his chair. They were witnesses to a turning point, though they didn't yet understand it. Michael's voice rose, trembling slightly now. "Dad, come on. You don't understand, we need that money. The mortgage, the repairs, Emma's dentist, Ethan's soccer. James raised a hand, cutting him off. I understand perfectly. You've been taking my money for years, expecting compliance, taking advantage of a father who loves you. But this time it's different. I've prepared, I've planned, and now you will see that I am not powerless. The kitchen felt smaller, the winter sunlight failing to warm the room. James reached into his coat pocket and retrieved the manila folder he had been carrying discreetly for weeks. Inside were documents, bank statements, pension records, receipts for every payment he had made on the house, and correspondence documenting Michael's unauthorized withdrawals. Michael's eyes widened as he caught sight of the folder. A flicker of uncertainty replaced his usual confidence. What's that? James placed it on the table deliberately, sliding it toward him with the precision of a man who had rehearsed this moment endlessly. Evidence, he said simply. Evidence of every penny you've taken without consent. Of every violation of trust, of every act of theft and abuse. And I've contacted someone who can make sure justice is served. Michael's face paled. The smirk was gone, replaced by a mixture of fear and anger. He glanced at Sarah, who looked as though she wished she could vanish from the room entirely. The twins stared wide-eyed, sensing the gravity of the confrontation, but unable to comprehend the full scope. This isn't a negotiation, James continued, his voice steady. I've filed reports, prepared documentation, and tomorrow letters will be sent and legal proceedings will begin. You can try to hide, you can try to stall, but the law is on my side. And this time I will not be ignored, not by you, not by anyone. Michael's hands shook slightly as he reached toward the papers, but James's gaze held him back. Do not touch them, James said, the authority in his voice leaving no room for argument. Every move you make is recorded. Every action you take is now part of a permanent record. This is the trigger, Michael. This is where the consequences of your actions begin. The room was silent except for the ticking of the kitchen clock, each second hammering like a drumbeat of inevitability. James felt a strange mixture of adrenaline and calm, the paradoxical clarity that comes when you've been pushed to the edge and realize you have the strength to push back. Michael slumped back in his chair, eyes fixed on the folder, suddenly aware of the full scope of his father's determination. You can't, he whispered, a tremor in his voice betraying his panic. James leaned forward slightly, not to intimidate, but to assert the truth of his words. I can, and I will. For every year you've exploited me, for every moment you've treated me as a resource instead of a human being, there will be accountability. The first letters go out tomorrow. The first steps toward justice begin now. The twins shuffled nervously, their small hands gripping each other. Sensing the shift in power, Sarah's lips pressed together, a silent acknowledgement of the inevitability that had entered the room. And Michael, who had spent years believing he could manipulate and control, finally saw the man before him, aged, yes, but unbreakable, resolute, and fully aware of the law and the moral weight behind his actions. James exhaled slowly, feeling the tension begin to release like steam from a pressurized boiler. He had crossed from victim to actor. The trigger had been pulled, the first domino was set to fall, and there would be no turning back. For the first time in decades, James Wilson felt a sense of power that had nothing to do with age or physical strength and everything to do with truth, preparation, and unshakable resolve. The stage was set, the evidence compiled, and the moment of reckoning approaching. He looked at Michael one last time that morning, his eyes meeting those of a son who had underestimated the consequences of greed, entitlement, and betrayal. Remember this day, James said quietly. This is when you learn that taking what isn't yours comes with consequences. And with that, he walked toward the door, folder in hand, the winter sunlight catching the edges of the manila paper like a promise. Outside, Detroit's streets sprawled before him, indifferent and bustling. Unaware that a quiet revolution was underway inside a modest home on Oak Street. James Wilson had been triggered, and from this moment forward, nothing would ever be the same. The morning sun, though timid at first, had begun to pierce the thin layer of smog hovering over Detroit. James Wilson stepped onto the porch, the chill biting through the worn layers of his coat. He inhaled sharply, the air tasting faintly of winter frost mixed with the metallic tang of the city. Even the streets, usually alive with the hum of buses, the screech of tires, and the chatter of people rushing to work, seemed unusually still, as if the entire city had paused to witness the storm brewing in a modest home on Oak Street. James's mind churned as he walked toward the mailbox. Each step echoed memories of years gone by, the heavy toll of factory labor, the exhaustion of double shifts, the nights he spent worrying about bills while the kids slept. Every memory was a thread in the tapestry of his life, each one reminding him why he could not and would not allow Michael to exploit him any longer. Back inside, Michael sat rigidly at the table, staring at the folder James had left behind. He fidgeted with the papers, curling and uncurling them like they were snakes ready to strike. The smirk he usually wore, the one that had masked years of entitlement, was gone, for the first time. The illusion of control had slipped through his fingers. Why now?" Michael finally asked, his voice low, almost breaking. James, standing in the hallway, did not immediately respond. He wanted Michael to feel the weight of his words before they even left his lips. He pictured the countless nights he had lain awake, calculating possibilities, imagining confrontations that had now come to life. Because James said finally, stepping closer, "There's only so much a man can endure before patience turns into action. You've taken what wasn't yours, manipulated those who trusted you, and assumed consequences would never catch up. But life and the law are relentless, and I've learned that the hard way." Sarah's hands trembled as she clutched the edge of the counter. She had long known that Michael had a way of bending reality to suit his desires, but this confrontation, this was new. Her eyes flickered between father and son, recognizing that the dynamic had irrevocably shifted. Emma and Ethan watched silently, their small bodies tense, the room's electric energy pressing down on them. They didn't fully grasp the legalities or the moral weight, but they felt the danger, the rupture in the familial fabric, and the enormity of their father's determination. James moved deliberately, opening the folder and spreading the documents across the kitchen table. Each statement, each record, was a testament to years of exploitation, meticulously documented. "See this," he said, pointing at a line item from last month. "You withdrew this from my account without permission," and here he tapped another sheet. "This and this and this, every instance, every act of betrayal recorded and verified." Michael leaned back, a flicker of panic creeping into his expression. He ran a hand through his hair, sweating slightly despite the winter chill. "You don't understand, things aren't that simple. We needed that money." James shook his head, the weight of decades of restraint pressing down with each word. "Needed it. You took it, you assumed it would be granted without question because you believed I was weak, because you assumed love equaled compliance. But you were wrong." The kitchen felt smaller, the walls almost pressing inward as tension thickened the air. Even the sunlight streaming through the window seemed hesitant, casting long, angular shadows across the scene of confrontation. James's mind raced through every contingency, every legal maneuver, every possible way Michael could resist. And yet, beneath the analytical thought, there was a quiet fury, a righteous indignation that had been simmering for decades. James continued, his voice calm but carrying a lethal edge. "Tomorrow, letters are sent, legal action begins. You will not hide, you will not stall, and you will not manipulate your way out of accountability. Every move you make will be monitored, every response documented. This is the beginning of the consequences you've been avoiding." Michael's hands hovered over the papers, uncertain, trembling. His usual confidence, the aura of entitlement, had vanished, leaving only raw fear. You can't do this," he said, desperation lacing his tone. "You can't." James cut him off, stepping forward not to intimidate but to assert dominance and truth. "I can, and I will. For every year of deceit, for every dollar stolen, for every moment you treated me as nothing more than a bank, this will happen." The trigger has been pulled, Michael. The first domino is set to fall. Silence followed, heavy and suffocating. Even the twins, small as they were, could sense the gravity, the irreversible shift. Sarah pressed a hand to her chest, aware that the fragile threads holding the family together were now strained to the breaking point. James paused, allowing the weight of the moment to settle, then continued. "You think you've always been clever, but cleverness without conscience is nothing. And I have conscience, Michael, I have evidence, and tomorrow justice begins. You've underestimated me for too long, no more." Michael's eyes darted nervously, a man cornered yet unwilling to fully acknowledge the trap closing around him. He wanted to speak, to manipulate, to charm his way out, but the certainty in his father's gaze paralyzed him. Every memory of exploitation, every instance of greed, every manipulation now faced the unflinching clarity of justice. James walked toward the door, the folder clutched in one hand. Each step felt like the opening note of a symphony, the rhythm of inevitability echoing in the hall. Outside, Detroit's streets remained indifferent, unaware that a quiet storm had erupted within a house on Oak Street, a storm that would change lives forever. He paused at the threshold, glancing back once. "Remember this," he said softly, yet with absolute certainty. "This is the day everything changed. This is when actions met consequences." James stepped outside. The winter air sharp against his face, filling him with a strange clarity. He had transformed from a man worn down by life's pressures into an agent of accountability. The trigger had been pulled, and from this moment forward, nothing would remain the same. Evening arrived quietly, almost deceptively so. The sun had disappeared behind a thick blanket of clouds, and Detroit's streets took on a muted gray, echoing the turmoil that churned within the Wilson household. James sat alone in the living room, the glow of a single lamp casting jagged shadows across the walls. He held the folder of evidence tightly in his lap, as if it were both a shield and a weapon. The breakdown had begun not with a shout, not with a confrontation, but with the quiet realization that everything he had built, everything he had trusted, was fragile. The family he thought secure, the life he thought predictable, had been infiltrated by betrayal. Michael's greed, Sarah's quiet complicity at times, even the city's indifferent pulse, all of it compounded into a weight James could no longer ignore. He leaned back, his chair creaking under the pressure of years' worth of suppressed frustration. Memories surged unbidden, nights spent over bills, arguments swept under the rug, promises made and broken. Each recollection was a jagged shard of glass, cutting deeper as he allowed himself to feel the full magnitude of the past. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the window panes like the city itself was mirroring the chaos inside. James's mind raced, a torrent of fear, anger, and exhaustion. He had tried to suppress it, to compartmentalize it. But now suppression seemed impossible. The breakdown was not a single moment, it was a tide, relentless, pulling him under. Sarah entered quietly, her face pale. "James, are you okay?" she asked, though her voice carried the weight of doubt, the awareness that nothing would ever be simple again. James turned slowly, the shadows under his eyes making him look older than his years. "I am," he said, but the words sounded hollow even to him. I can't ignore what's happening anymore. I can't pretend it's all fine." She approached, hesitant, as if afraid her presence might shatter him completely. "We'll get through this," she whispered, but James saw through the veneer of reassurance. He knew that promises were powerless against the kind of pain that had been building for decades. Michael, meanwhile, retreated to his room, slamming the door with a force that rattled the plaster. He was beginning to feel the first sharp edges of consequences, the kind that could not be bargained with or manipulated away. His usual defiance wavered, leaving behind a man confronted with the reality that he had no control. James rose and walked toward the window, staring out at the city that had been both home and adversary. The streets, the factories, the empty lots, they all seemed to mock him. Every instance of past hardship, every injustice endured, every slight he had absorbed now crystallized into a singular clarity. Life could be cruel, and people could betray with the precision of surgeons. He clenched the folder in his hands, feeling the paper crumple beneath his grip. The breakdown was not just emotional, it was physical. His chest ached, his head throbbed, and the world outside felt simultaneously distant and unbearably close. He was both observer and participant in a collapse that had been building for decades. In the kitchen, Sarah tried to prepare dinner, but the clattering of pots and pans seemed meaningless, echoing the emptiness that had seeped into their lives. The children, sensing the tension, whispered among themselves, their small voices barely rising above the hum of a failing heating system. The breakdown had infiltrated every corner of their existence. James sank into the sofa, running his hands through his hair. Tears threatened, but he did not allow them. He had never been a man to show weakness, and yet now weakness seemed inevitable. It was not just Michael's betrayal, nor the financial manipulations. It was the cumulative weight of years of disappointment, neglect, and unresolved anger. He had tried to survive, to endure, to maintain dignity, but the collapse of order around him made endurance feel like surrender. He thought of his own father, long gone, and how James had watched him crumble under pressures that now mirrored his own. Patterns repeated. Generations were trapped in cycles of suffering. And James feared he was powerless to break them. The realization was suffocating, the knowledge that pain was both legacy and inheritance. Suddenly, a loud crash from Michael's room jolted the household. James's heart leapt. The breakdown had reached a fever pitch, spilling into action. He hurried down the hallway to find the door swung wide, books and papers strewn across the floor. Michael sat amid the chaos, head in hands, sobbing for the first time in his life. James stood there for a moment, witnessing the culmination of years of tension. A boy who had grown into a man through manipulation and entitlement, now reduced to raw despair. Compassion and frustration warred within him. This was the end point of pain, the moment when guilt, fear, and powerlessness collided in a perfect storm. Sarah arrived, placing a hand on Michael's shoulder. "It's okay," she murmured. "We'll figure this out." But James knew that words were insufficient. Pain was not healed by reassurances. It was endured, faced, and sometimes weaponized. Returning to the living room, James collapsed back into the sofa, letting the darkness of the room wrap around him. The breakdown had reached a point where even the simplest acts of life, breathing, thinking, surviving, felt monumental. Every sound, every shadow, every memory amplified the anguish. The household itself seemed to sigh under the collective strain, walls whispering secrets of suffering, floors creaking under unspoken weight. Hours passed, though time felt irrelevant. James stared at the ceiling, seeing fragments of his life projected across it. Moments of joy, moments of betrayal, moments of quiet, hollow acceptance. Each shard was a reflection of a soul forced to confront its limits, the edges of sanity fraying under relentless pressure. Finally, the children, exhausted by the emotional storm, fell asleep on the living room floor, blankets barely covering their small forms. Sarah sat beside James, silent but present. He placed a hand over hers, seeking connection, grounding, reassurance. In the midst of breakdown, there was still a flicker of humanity, a reminder that even in the depths of suffering, the ties of family, the threads of care could remain. Yet James knew this was only the beginning. The breakdown was necessary, inevitable, a precursor to transformation. Pain had reached its zenith, cruelty had exposed its face, and now the stage was set for choices that would determine the trajectory of their lives. He closed his eyes, allowing himself a single breath, acknowledging both the magnitude of despair and the flickering potential for resilience. The breakdown had stripped them bare, but in that bareness lay possibility. The real question was whether they would succumb to the ruin or rise from it. The night deepened, and the city outside seemed to breathe with a restless energy. Detroit's streets were empty, save for the occasional flickering street lamp or the distant roar of a car engine. But inside the Wilson home, the atmosphere was thick with tension, a suffocating mix of fear, anger, and despair. Every small sound, creaking floors, dripping faucets, the wind rattling the blinds, was amplified, echoing the fragility of the family's existence. James sat hunched over, the folder of evidence still clutched in his hands, his knuckles white. Each paper felt like a weight, each photograph a revelation of betrayal and deceit. He traced the edges with trembling fingers, remembering each moment that had led to this breaking point. Years of small compromises, overlooked injustices, and silent endurance had built an invisible prison around him. Now that prison was collapsing, brick by brick, under the force of reality. Michael remained in his room, his sobs quiet but unrelenting. The boy-turned-man who had once believed himself untouchable was now confronting the raw truth. His actions had consequences. The arrogance, the manipulations, the dismissive cruelty toward his family, all of it now crashed down on him. He had been building walls around himself for years, shields against empathy and responsibility, but tonight those walls were gone. Sarah moved carefully through the house, trying to maintain a semblance of normalcy. She whispered words of reassurance to the children who had curled into blankets on the living room floor, their eyes wide and fearful. But even her voice trembled, betraying the tension she struggled to hide. She knew the breakdown had stripped them all bare, leaving nothing but raw emotion and uncertainty. James finally rose, moving toward Michael's room with hesitant steps. The hallway felt longer than it should, the shadows stretching like dark fingers across the walls. When he opened the door, the sight of Michael sitting amidst the chaos of scattered papers and overturned furniture hit him with a visceral force. The room was a mirror of the emotional turmoil that had been building for years, a tangible manifestation of brokenness. Michael James's voice was low, almost a whisper. It carried a mixture of grief, frustration, and concern. "Look at what's happening. Look at what this has done to us." Michael lifted his head, tears streaking his face, the defiance that had once defined him now replaced by vulnerability. I didn't know it would." His words faltered, swallowed by the magnitude of his own guilt. James shook his head, the weight of disappointment pressing down like a physical force. "Intentions don't erase consequences. You can't undo the past, Michael. You can only face it and accept what it brings." Back in the living room, Sarah sank into a chair beside James, placing a trembling hand over his. Their eyes met, and for a moment the sheer exhaustion of the night created a fragile connection. They had endured pain before, but never like this. Never with so much at stake, never with so little certainty of what tomorrow would bring. The children, sensing the intensity of the adult world, pressed closer to each other. Their whispers were barely audible. Questions hanging in the air. Why is Papa so sad? Will everything be okay? James wanted to answer, to provide comfort, but the words felt empty. How could he explain the collapse of trust, the crushing weight of betrayal, the gnawing reality that life could be fundamentally unfair? Time became fluid, stretching and compressing in disorienting waves. James wandered through the house, moving from room to room, encountering reminders of better times, family photos on the mantel. Toys left scattered on the floor, the faint scent of meals long past. Each memory was a dagger, a reminder of what had been lost and what might never return. He stopped in the kitchen, staring at the empty countertop. Once this had been a place of warmth and sustenance. Now it felt hollow, like the walls themselves were mourning. He pressed his forehead to the cool surface, letting the stillness and silence envelop him. In that moment he allowed himself to feel fully, the despair, the fear. The rage, the breakdown was complete. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows with increasing force. It was as if the city itself had joined in the household's anguish, mirroring the chaos and instability within. Rain began to patter against the roof, soft at first, then insistent, drumming a relentless rhythm. Each drop was a reminder that the world continued to move forward, indifferent to suffering, indifferent to grief. James returned to Michael's room. Sitting quietly on the edge of the bed, "We can't let this destroy us," he said softly, more to himself than to his son. "But we have to face it. Every lie, every mistake, every betrayal, we have to confront the truth, no matter how painful." Michael nodded slowly, understanding finally dawning. I'll try," he whispered. It was the first hint of responsibility, the first step toward rebuilding what had been fractured. The night wore on, long and merciless. Shadows deepened. Emotions flared, and the Wilson family sat on the precipice of change. The breakdown had stripped them of illusions, exposing raw, unvarnished reality. But in that exposure lay potential, the possibility of facing pain, of confronting mistakes, and perhaps eventually of redemption. James finally lay down on the sofa, exhaustion pulling at him like a physical force. The house was silent now, save for the soft patter of rain and the occasional sigh from Sarah or a restless child. Darkness enveloped them all, yet within that darkness, a fragile ember remained, the ember of awareness, of recognition, of the need to rebuild. Pain had reached its apex, trust had been shattered. The consequences of actions long past were fully realized, and yet, even in this nadir, the seeds of resilience, empathy, and transformation had been planted. The breakdown was complete, but the story was far from over. The first rays of dawn filtered through the cracked blinds, casting fragmented light across the Wilson household. The night had been long, harrowing, a brutal exposure of raw emotions and fractured bonds. But now, in the fragile quiet of early morning, a subtle transformation was beginning, one that was invisible yet inexorable, stirring within the hearts of those who had been pushed to the edge. James stirred on the sofa, his body aching from hours of restless tension. But it wasn't only physical exhaustion that weighed him down. It was a deep, gnawing awareness of failure, of the ways he had allowed circumstances, pride, and inaction to dictate the trajectory of his family's life. He closed his eyes and let the silence wash over him, forcing himself to confront truths he had long avoided. For the first time, he recognized the insidious patterns that had guided their existence. The avoidance of difficult conversations, the excuses for misconduct. The silent toleration of anger and resentment, these were not mere accidents, they were choices, and choices had consequences. The weight of that realization pressed down like iron, yet within it lay the faintest glimmer of liberation. To recognize the pattern was the first step toward breaking it. In the kitchen, Sarah moved quietly, preparing a pot of coffee. Her hands shook slightly, betraying the inner tumult she had struggled to suppress throughout the night. She paused, inhaling the rich aroma, and allowed herself a moment of clarity. The breakdown had been devastating, but it had also peeled away the layers of denial and fear. She saw for the first time that clinging to old habits and illusions of control had only perpetuated pain. Michael remained in his room, seated cross-legged on the floor amidst the wreckage of scattered papers. His eyes were red, and his hands bore faint marks of self-inflicted frustration. But beneath the surface turmoil, a shift was occurring, a subtle, almost imperceptible turning inward. He was beginning to understand the weight of responsibility, the significance of actions and choices, and the necessity of confronting the self. The inner shift was not sudden, nor was it dramatic in an outward sense. It was a slow, meticulous unpeeling of mental layers, a conscious examination of motives, fears, and desires. James thought of his father, long absent, and the legacy of unresolved conflicts and unspoken regrets. He thought of the pride that had once defined him, and how it had blinded him to vulnerability, to compassion, to the fragile humanity of those around him. "Maybe that's it," James murmured aloud, startling even himself. "Maybe change isn't about fixing everything immediately. Maybe it's about understanding, accepting, and making conscious decisions from now on." In Michael's room, a similar realization was quietly taking shape. He studied the torn edges of documents that had once been merely evidence of deceit, but now served as mirrors of his own behavior. Each line, each photograph, each revealed secret demanded introspection. The reckoning wasn't just about punishment or blame, it was about comprehension and, more importantly, transformation. The family, though physically separated in different rooms, shared a collective awakening. It was subtle yet profound, a mutual recognition of the human capacity for error, the necessity of accountability, and the potential for personal growth. The breakdown had stripped them bare, leaving nothing but the essentials: raw emotion, critical self-reflection, and the fragile seed of renewal. As James wandered through the house, he noticed the small details that had previously gone unnoticed, the way sunlight kissed the dust motes in the air, the faint scent of coffee mingling with the morning breeze, the quiet hum of life continuing despite the chaos. These details were grounding, reminders that the world persisted, indifferent yet patient, offering space for reflection and renewal. Sarah joined him in the hallway, their eyes meeting in a silent acknowledgement of shared struggle and emerging understanding. "We can't change the past," she said softly, "but maybe we can decide how we move forward." James nodded, attention easing from his shoulders. "It starts with awareness, with honesty, and it starts now." Michael emerged from his room, tentative yet purposeful. His steps were cautious, as though traversing unknown psychological terrain. He stopped in the center of the living room, looking at his parents. I want to try," he said, the words unsteady but sincere. "I want to understand and do better." The inner shift wasn't instantaneous. It required continuous engagement with uncomfortable truths. It demanded that each family member face the darkest corners of their own psyche, the jealousy, fear, anger, and arrogance that had fueled past conflicts. Yet in confronting these shadows, they began to reclaim agency over their lives. Awareness became empowerment, reflection became direction, and remorse became motivation. James took a deep breath, feeling the gravity of his own shortcomings. He acknowledged the times he had avoided conflict, ignored warning signs, and allowed pride to dictate responses. But instead of succumbing to despair, he reframed these moments as opportunities for conscious change. The inner shift was not about self-flagellation, it was about deliberate transformation. In parallel, Sarah confronted the patterns of codependence and silent suffering she had embraced for too long. She realized that protecting the family by denying her own needs had only reinforced dysfunction. With clarity, she recognized the importance of establishing boundaries, of communicating honestly, and of modeling resilience for the children. Michael's journey was perhaps the most turbulent. He wrestled with shame and guilt, acknowledging the gravity of his actions and their ripple effects. Yet through the lens of self-awareness, he began to see a path forward, one that involved accountability, restitution, and the cultivation of empathy. Each small recognition was a stepping stone, guiding him towards psychological maturity and moral consciousness. By midday, the Wilson family convened in the living room. Tentative yet united, the atmosphere was heavy, but there was an underlying sense of possibility, a quiet understanding that pain could be a catalyst for transformation. Words were spoken carefully, with pauses for reflection, and emotions were acknowledged rather than suppressed. James spoke first, his voice steady but gentle. "We've been broken in many ways, individually and together. But now we have a chance to rebuild not just the family, but ourselves. To confront the truths we've avoided and to act with integrity moving forward." Sarah added, "It won't be easy, there will be setbacks, but this awareness is the first step. If we embrace it, we can grow stronger." Michael nodded, his eyes shining with tentative determination. "I'm ready to take responsibility, to face what I've done and learn from it, and then to start rebuilding trust." The inner shift was underway, a psychological pivot from despair to awareness. From passivity to intentionality. It was a conscious movement from chaos to clarity, from fragmentation to integration. Each member of the family, though scarred, was beginning to recognize the power of self-reflection, the value of honesty, and the potential for redemption. Even the children sensed it, observing the subtle change in tone, the careful acknowledgement of emotions, the willingness to speak truths that had previously been avoided. Hope, though fragile, began to permeate the atmosphere, like the first rays of sunlight breaking through storm clouds. The shift was profound not because it erased pain, but because it embraced it. By acknowledging suffering and confronting the shadows of their past, the Wilson family began to reclaim their agency, their dignity, and their humanity. The day progressed, punctuated by moments of silence, conversation, and shared reflection. Every gesture, every glance carried meaning. Every acknowledgement of error, every admission of vulnerability, reinforced the inner transformation taking place. They were learning to inhabit their own minds fully, to confront uncomfortable truths without denial, and to cultivate resilience in the face of adversity. By evening, the shift had crystallized. Each family member felt the subtle but undeniable weight of awakening, the realization that life could not be controlled by fear, pride, or avoidance, but could be navigated consciously, with intention, integrity, and empathy. Pain remained, but it was now accompanied by insight. And insight offered direction. The inner shift, the crucial psychological pivot, was complete. It did not resolve all conflicts, nor did it erase the scars of past actions. But it laid the foundation for the next stage of their journey: conscious decision-making, emotional resilience, and the possibility of reconciliation. The Wilson family, though still fragile and uncertain, had crossed a threshold from reactive existence to deliberate living. The Wilson family's quiet awakening had set the stage for a reckoning. The inner shift was no longer enough. It had created awareness, yes, but awareness demanded action. And action, in their case, was not gentle. It was justice, retribution, and reclaiming the dignity that had been stripped from them. James sat at the head of the table, a map of strategies spread before him, not of military campaigns, but of carefully planned moves designed to expose deceit, challenge corruption, and reclaim stolen ground. His hands trembled slightly, not with fear, but with the intensity of purpose. For too long they had been passive observers in their own lives, victims of circumstance and malice. Now the momentum had shifted. "Everything starts with evidence," James said, his voice firm. "We can't rely on luck or threats. We have to show them, prove to them that we won't be silent anymore." Sarah nodded, her eyes sharp and focused. Her inner awakening had translated into a new form of courage, one that was not reactive but calculated. "We've spent too long accommodating their abuses. It's time to set boundaries, expose the lies, and demand accountability. But we have to do it carefully, strategically." Michael, once hesitant and burdened by guilt, now mirrored his parents' resolve. "I've learned from my mistakes," he said. "I know what to do, I just need to make sure we don't slip back into old patterns." The Wilsons' plan unfolded methodically. The first step was gathering undeniable proof. Documents, recordings, witnesses, every shred of information that had previously been overlooked or dismissed was now a weapon. They combed through emails, files, and conversations, piecing together a mosaic of deceit and injustice. The process was painstaking, sometimes infuriating, but each discovery fortified their determination. The next step was confrontation, but not impulsive confrontation. James and Sarah understood that anger alone could destroy more than it could achieve. They had to be precise, targeted, and deliberate. The people who had wronged them, co-workers, former associates, and even distant acquaintances who had betrayed trust, would be faced not with irrational fury, but with incontrovertible evidence and calculated strategy. In the office of their adversary, tensions simmered before any words were spoken. James's presence alone was unsettling. A quiet storm waiting to erupt. Sarah, standing beside him, radiated controlled intensity, a visual declaration that they were no longer defenseless. Michael remained near the doorway, watching, learning, and ready to act if necessary. The confrontation began subtly, almost innocuously. Questions were posed with the precision of a scalpel, designed to expose inconsistencies without appearing accusatory. Each lie, each evasive answer was catalogued mentally. Each hesitation a confirmation of guilt. By the time the room realized the gravity of the situation, the Wilsons had already woven a network of undeniable proof that could not be dismissed. "You underestimated us," James said calmly, letting his voice cut through the tension like a blade. "And that was your first mistake. The evidence speaks for itself. You can deny it, deflect it, or attempt to intimidate, but the truth doesn't negotiate." The reaction was immediate: shock, anger, and desperate attempts to regain control, but the Wilsons were prepared. Each tactic had a countermeasure, each bluff a strategic response. They moved with precision. A choreography born from necessity, experience, and psychological insight. Outside the office, the world seemed oblivious to the storm within, but inside, a subtle reversal had already taken place. Those who had wielded power carelessly, relying on fear and manipulation, were now exposed to the very reality they had sought to hide. Their empire of control was cracking, and they could do nothing but watch as the Wilsons reclaimed their narrative, their agency, and their dignity. Justice in this context was not abstract. It was tactical, precise, and inevitable. It did not require malice. It required courage, intelligence, and relentless commitment. And as the confrontation reached its peak, the Wilsons found themselves not only vindicated but empowered. The psychological shift that had begun in Part 5 had now manifested externally, transforming internal awareness into tangible action. But the path of payback was never simple. Retribution came with risk, tension, and moral ambiguity. The Wilsons had to navigate not only the machinations of their adversaries but also their own impulses. Anger, if left unchecked, could undermine their objectives. They reminded each other constantly: precision, strategy, clarity. The end goal was justice, not chaos. Michael played a crucial role, leveraging the lessons of his previous mistakes. He had learned to anticipate countermoves, to read intentions, and to act decisively without succumbing to emotion. In this moment, he was no longer the passive bystander of earlier conflicts. He was an active participant, integral to the family's strategy and success. Sarah, whose endurance had been tested beyond measure, now embodied a calm ferocity. She understood that the act of reclaiming power was as much about psychological dominance as it was about physical or legal proof. Every measured glance, every poised response reinforced their authority and dismantled the facade of control maintained by their adversaries. The Wilsons' calculated approach paid off. Their adversaries faltered under scrutiny, their lies and manipulations exposed for all to see. Accountability was no longer a theoretical concept, it was an unavoidable reality. The reversal was complete. Those who had once inflicted suffering found themselves powerless, while the Wilsons reclaimed not only justice but self-respect, dignity, and authority. Yet the Wilsons understood that payback was not about vengeance in the traditional sense. It was about balance. restoration and reclaiming what had been lost. They sought to dismantle corruption, correct injustice, and protect themselves from future exploitation. Their actions were deliberate, ethical, and uncompromising, reflecting a maturity born of profound inner transformation. As the dust settled, the family reflected on the journey from chaos to empowerment. The emotional turbulence, the breakdowns, and the subsequent awakening had prepared them for this moment. The inner shift had created the clarity, and now the external actions had enacted it. They had navigated the perilous terrain of retribution without losing themselves, without allowing anger to override strategy or morality. Even as they celebrated this hard-won justice, they knew that life's complexities would continue. New challenges, rivalries, and ethical dilemmas would arise. But the Wilsons now possessed a blueprint for navigating these trials, an understanding that awareness, strategy, and moral clarity could turn adversity into empowerment. The day concluded with a profound sense of accomplishment, tempered by humility and cautious optimism. Justice had been served, but the journey had also instilled deeper lessons: vigilance, resilience, and the ongoing necessity of self-awareness. They had learned that revenge without principle was destructive. But justice, tempered by insight and strategy, could restore balance and dignity. In the quiet of the evening, James, Sarah, and Michael sat together, reflecting on their victory and the trials that had led them here. The air was heavy with emotion, yet filled with the subtle light of growth and empowerment. They had reclaimed their narrative, confronted their adversaries, and emerged stronger, not only as a family, but as individuals capable of navigating life's most treacherous terrain with clarity and resolve. The reversal, the act of reclaiming what was stolen, was not merely a chapter in their lives, it was a defining moment. It demonstrated the power of conscious action, the necessity of courage in the face of manipulation, and the enduring capacity of humans to rise above oppression through strategy, insight, and unwavering determination. The Wilsons sat in their home, the silence of the evening wrapping around them like a soft blanket. It was not a silence of emptiness, but of presence, a calm after the storm, a reflective pause after years of chaos and turmoil. The acts of confrontation, exposure, and justice had been exhausting, both physically and emotionally. And now, in this quiet, the weight of everything they had endured and achieved began to settle into something more permanent, more contemplative. James looked at his family, at Sarah and Michael, and for the first time in years he felt a deep sense of completion. Not of victory in the conventional sense, there were no celebrations or fanfare, but of harmony restored within their own lives. They had fought, strategized, and reclaimed their dignity, yet in this calm moment the true essence of their journey became clear. It was about understanding, resilience, and the quiet strength that comes from surviving the storm. Sarah broke the silence, her voice soft but steady. "Do you remember how powerless we felt before all of this began?" she asked. "It seems like a lifetime ago, and yet in some ways it feels like yesterday." Her gaze was fixed on the window where the last rays of the sun filtered through, painting the room in muted gold. There was a reflective quality in her tone, an acknowledgement of both the pain endured and the lessons learned. Michael, sitting cross-legged on the floor, nodded thoughtfully. "It's strange," he said. "I thought that getting justice would solve everything, that it would erase the fear and anger, but it doesn't. It changes you. It teaches you to see clearly, to choose carefully, and to value every moment of peace." The family's reflection turned inward, exploring the subtle transformations that had occurred within themselves. The trials they faced had left marks, not just scars, but imprints of wisdom and insight. Each confrontation, each strategic move had forced them to confront aspects of their own character, their fears, their weaknesses, and their capacity for resilience. And in doing so, they had emerged with a heightened sense of self-awareness, capable of discerning what truly mattered. James thought back to the days of confusion and despair, to the nights when doubt had consumed him and the pressure of injustice had felt unbearable. The path to reclaiming justice had not been linear. It had been a maze of obstacles, both external and internal. He realized that the journey itself had been a teacher, shaping their resolve, strengthening their bonds, and refining their understanding of morality and human behavior. Sarah reflected on the moments of inner awakening, the turning points where despair had shifted to clarity. I learned that anger alone is not enough, she said. It must be tempered with insight. Power without clarity can destroy you from the inside. That's why every move we made, every confrontation we planned, had to come from a place of understanding, not just emotion. The quiet house echoed with these sentiments, a testament to the transformative nature of their experiences. In the absence of chaos, they discovered a new form of energy, a calm, deliberate, and enduring force that could guide them through life's uncertainties. This was not a calm born of surrender, but of mastery, a mastery of self, circumstance, and perception. As night descended, the Wilsons' reflections expanded beyond themselves, touching on broader truths about life, justice, and human nature. They considered the cycles of conflict and reconciliation, the delicate balance between action and restraint, and the importance of maintaining integrity even when confronted with betrayal. Their journey had illustrated a universal lesson, that true strength lies not in domination, but in the wisdom to act with purpose and compassion. James turned his attention to the notion of legacy. What would remain after their struggles? Not just tangible victories or exposed deceit, but the intangible essence of courage, resilience, and moral clarity. They had endured trials that could have broken them, yet they had emerged with a profound understanding of themselves and the world around them. That, James realized, was the true inheritance they would leave, an enduring example of the power of conscious action and thoughtful reflection. Sarah spoke next, her voice tinged with both melancholy and gratitude. "We may never fully escape the shadows of the past," she said, "but we can choose how those shadows shape us. We can allow them to guide us toward wisdom, not fear, toward courage, not anger." Her words resonated in the room, a gentle acknowledgement of the complexity of healing and growth. Michael, contemplating the journey from victimhood to empowerment, added, "I think what stays with you most isn't the conflict itself, but the way you respond to it. We couldn't control everything that happened to us, but we could control how we chose to act. That's the part that matters. That's what defines us." Their reflections also encompassed gratitude for survival, for clarity, and for each other. The bonds forged through shared struggle were now deeper and more resilient than ever. They understood that the strength of family, of trust, and mutual support had been a cornerstone of their ability to navigate chaos and claim justice. In the stillness of the night, the Wilsons also allowed themselves to grieve the losses incurred along the way. Not just tangible losses, but the innocence, trust, and naivety that had been shattered by deceit and betrayal. Acknowledging this grief was not a sign of weakness, but of maturity, a recognition that growth often requires letting go of what once was to embrace what can be. The final reflection, then, was a meditation on balance between action and restraint, between justice and compassion, between past pain and future possibility. They had learned that life's challenges are rarely neat or fair, but through deliberate thought, courage, and ethical conduct, one could navigate even the most treacherous waters without losing sight of self or purpose. As the first stars appeared in the night sky, the Wilsons found a profound sense of peace. It was not the fleeting relief of a battle won, nor the empty triumph of revenge. It was the enduring tranquility that comes from having faced adversity fully, acted with clarity, and accepted the lessons it offered. In this quiet reflection, they realized that life, in all its complexity, offered continuous opportunities for growth, understanding, and meaningful action. They knew that challenges would come again, life would continue to test their resilience and judgment, but the inner strength cultivated through struggle, the wisdom gained from reflection, and the courage to act ethically and deliberately would serve as a guiding light. They were no longer defined solely by what had been done to them, but by how they chose to respond, grow, and live. In the end, the Wilsons embraced the simplicity of existence, moments of quiet, moments of reflection, and the enduring recognition that the human spirit, when nurtured and directed wisely, could withstand any storm. The echoes of past conflicts remained, but they were no longer shackles. They were reminders of the journey, markers of growth, and testaments to resilience. The family sat together, each absorbed in thought, yet connected through shared understanding. No words were necessary. The presence of one another, the unspoken acknowledgement of pain endured and lessons learned sufficed. In that shared silence, they discovered a profound truth, that the ultimate power lies not in domination, retribution, or recognition by others, but in the quiet mastery of oneself and the conscious choice to live with integrity, courage, and reflection. The night deepened, and with it the Wilsons' sense of permanence and grounding. The tumultuous events that had once threatened to define their lives were now transformed into a source of wisdom and perspective. Every hardship, every betrayal, and every moment of fear had been transmuted into insight and strength, leaving them capable of facing the future with clarity, courage, and serenity. And so, the story closes not with grand fanfare or dramatic flourish, but with quiet, enduring reflection. It is a meditation on resilience, ethical action, and the power of conscious choice, the final stillness after the storm, where the lessons of struggle are absorbed and the human spirit emerges tempered, illuminated, and profoundly alive.